Russia's leaders and central bankers are scrambling today to deal with the dramatic fall of the ruble. The country's currency has dropped to the lowest since the early days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's partly because of all the sanctions that Western nations have piled on. Jeannie Lee joins us now with more. So, Jeannie, let's start with how low is the ruble?
Well, it's hit a psychological level at which you go, wow, because, you don't really realize from day to day what's going on until certain barriers are fall, essentially. And that's happened today with the ruble falling to a value against the U.S. dollar of less than 100 rubles to the U.S. dollar. And it's especially jarring when you consider that 14 months ago, the ruble was flying high. In fact, it hit a 7-year high, and it was twice as much as it's worth today. So the ruble has lost half its value in a very short time. So let's take a look at that. This graph, you can predict how it's going to go, and there it is, all the way down. And this is the past year, so it doesn't even include, let's say, June and July of last year. But in the 1-year slide, it's 40% and 100% if you went back as far as the peak in June of 2022. And what has this done? It basically erodes the value of the Russian ruble. It means that erodes the purchasing power of Russian citizens and Russian businesses, and of course the Russian government too. So everyone pays more for imports. That tends to make life very expensive. And at the same time, you have the ruble being the third weakest currency in the world this year, and that isn't exactly spelling victory for President Vladimir Putin, who would like, of course, victory on all fronts, including the currency. So there is a general meeting being called, an emergency meeting by the central bank, which started the day saying, you know what, everything's fine, it's all good. Russia's economic stability and financial stability are just dandy. And then hours later, it called this emergency meeting, and it's going to be talking about interest rates. This is going to happen overnight, our time. So at 3:30 a.m. Eastern, we're going to find out what the Russian central bank is going to do to prop up the ruble, and most likely it'll be to prop up interest rates. But you can see, Diane, because we've suffered here in Canada with higher interest rates too, that can cause all kinds of other pain as well.
Absolutely. But now, hasn't Russia already been taking some smaller steps to prop up the ruble?
Yes, and we did see, as I said, the ruble being propped up to the point of, hitting a 7-year high just last year, but it's all kind of crumbled since. So let's look at exactly what's happened. Number one, early on, the Russian government took some steps in basically limiting the outflow of Russian rubles so that you couldn't just send your money offshore, and that did help prop up the value. The other thing is that sanctions have really slashed oil revenue. This is a big moneymaker for Russia, of course, and the West's various sanctions, not just against oil, but other Russian exports, really has precipitated this drop. And then you have the fact that the government, Russia's government, is spending billions upon billions of dollars on the military, and this is ongoing. And you're getting that money, the ruble, you're spending a lot of that on imports to Russia, which of course are paid for in lower and lower rubles. That becomes an expensive exercise, and so much that it takes up such a chunk of the government's budget that can be destabilizing. And then in June, things got worse when Russians started to really send as much of their money out of the country as possible. This is after that failed uprising by one of the factions. And so you have this emergency meeting, and the last time I think there was a major intervention by Russia in its currency was the 1998 ruble currency crisis, essentially, and that was so long ago, and yet here we are talking about that again. So we'll watch that meeting very closely.